giant carriers of the United States Navy are probably the most powerful machines of war ever created. With its planes deployed, a carrier can dominate an enormous area. There are millions of parts to the machine, and the sum of these parts is a hybrid, capable of dominating both the air and the sea, and able to extend that domination over land. The aircraft carrier is, today, the most important surface ship of the fleet. 80 years ago, the carrier was a set of problems for the naval architect, and the subject of discussion for only the most advanced and imaginative of naval theorists. Its rise has been meteoric. Even at the outbreak of World War II, many naval men felt that aviation was only an aid to the battleships, which were still widely regarded as the business end of naval force. Just 5 years later, the battleship had been made obsolete. World War II established the aircraft carrier at the head of the fleet, and the images of carrier war are, for many, the most familiar and evocative records of the conflict. The result of the Pacific War was largely determined by the battles between the Japanese and American carrier forces. Once the Japanese had been stripped of their naval air power, the island-hopping might of the Allies was irresistible, and the outcome, no matter how bitterly contested, was unavoidable. While on land, the aeroplane and tank destroyed old concepts of warfare. At sea, the carriers had completely changed the scale and nature of naval engagement. The battleship's mighty guns had extended the arm of the fleet, but the carrier's mobile artillery could deliver torpedoes and bombs at far greater range. The only real threat to a carrier far at sea was the planes of another carrier. By war's end, the United States had built up a large fleet of carriers of all sizes, designed to fill all the needs for naval air support and attack. At times, groups of carriers were formed capable of mounting 1,000-plane raids while still maintaining fleet defense. Victory surely owed much to the flat tops. When these shots of United States ironclads were filmed in 1900, even the battleship was a relative newcomer, emerging from the international rivalries of the 1890s. The famous dreadnought herself dates only from 1904, by which time the aeroplane had arrived. The speed of the aeroplane's development is a signature of this remarkable century of technology. In 1903, aeroplanes barely flew. In 1914, they were advanced enough to be useful in war, and by 1918, they were unrecognizably advanced. On January the 26th, 1911, Glenn Curtiss made the first flight in a seaplane, and the Navy, an uncertain onlooker in aviation's development, began to take more serious interest in the aeroplane. Already, in December 1910, Lieutenant Theodore Ellison, the Navy's first pupil pilot, had commenced studying with Curtiss, and the Navy obtained its first aircraft in the following year. The most valuable early development was the growth of a group of flyers within the Navy who were enthusiastic proponents of the aeroplane and imaginative and serious students of its potential. Down the line, when it needed them, the Navy was equipped with experienced and dedicated aviators, capable of making the informed decisions needed in the development of naval aviation. In 1914, Europe plunged into the calamity of war. But no longer was warfare a matter of a small battlefield where armies clashed and victory was decided relatively quickly. Static fronts, dominated by artillery and machine guns, saw the opponents trapped in a process of attrition. In a contest where flesh and blood was thrown at steel bullets and shells, flesh and blood could not be expected to prevail. Above the tormented infantry, aeroplanes developed from simply being the eyes of the artillery and the generals. With their arming, they required a reappraisal, both as a potential threat and a potential tool. In the war against the submarine, they achieved their first real naval significance, and the first naval aviation activity after America's entry into the war was anti-submarine patrol.
I'll never forget one of the first flights I took out of Montauk. With Warrant Officer Thron, I flew to Martha's Vineyard on a search for submarines. I had no bombs with which to attack them if I saw them, but I didn't see any anyway.
Captain Sugden's remarks underline the rudimentary state of the United States' readiness for war. Without radio to report sightings of submarines or weapons to attack them, the early patrols were almost pointless. Germany's subs created havoc among the shipping vital to the Allied war effort, and the battle to suppress them was fought with desperate urgency. The war against the submarine was to be greatly affected by the aeroplane, and by war's end, patrol aircraft, armed with depth charges and escorted by fighter planes, were a real threat to any submarine they came across. The sophistication of American aircraft was greatly increased by the alliance with the British. They had been making rapid technical advances in the seesaw battle for superior technology in the air war both over land and sea. In the defense of her vulnerable sea approaches, where the shipping congregated to enter port, Britain had developed planes with respectable endurance and weapons, and had made life increasingly difficult for the prowling German U-boats. At America's entry into the conflict, the mass production of British-designed planes formed the basis for the later emergence of the American aviation industry.
After the war had started in Europe, the British made rapid progress in flying boats for anti-submarine work, and we benefited from a knowledge gained from their experience. And by the time we were in the war, we were building at the Curtiss Company the H-16 and later the F-5 flying boats, of which thousands were built in this country and shipped abroad as anti-submarine patrol craft.
The US Navy's use of aircraft expanded rapidly, and the demand for aircraft was limited only by the availability of pilots to fly them. Many of the Navy's pilots were sent to Europe, and there was a great effort to train new flyers, selected from the abundant volunteers. Meanwhile, the developments went on, almost daily expanding the aeroplane's capability and versatility. The Royal Navy now had enough certainty about the aeroplane to see it as an essential element of future naval conflict, and was investing a huge effort into research. As in general aviation, the Navy's aeroplanes blossomed rapidly. With them grew the realization of the need for fleets to carry their planes with them, outside the protection of shore-based aircraft. In the years of war, many steps were taken which were to be of great long-term value. For example, naval considerations of space, originally with the seaplane tender in mind, led to the development of folding wings. These were subsequently to be rediscovered and become essential to the operations of the modern aircraft carrier. The first American servicemen into action in the European theatre were naval pilots, flying French and British aircraft on anti-submarine patrol work from bases along the French coast. The arriving American infantry would not have known, but the protective planes in their allies' roundels, which escorted them over the last part of their hazardous transatlantic passage, were piloted by fellow Americans. The Navy's corps of experienced aviators was now to gain a new body of practical experience in active service.
On a small lake outside Bordeaux, a place called Moujik was being established by the Navy at that time, which was to act as a pilot's pool. Our group was split up there. I was assigned to the U.S. Naval Air Station Le Croisic-French, which at that time was operated by the French Navy. When we arrived there, Lieutenant Commander William Corey, United States Navy, was in command, and our operation from that station consists of escorting the troop ships from the United States into Saint-Nazaire in convoy. We flew the French Terrier seaplane, and the patrols were long and tedious and very arduous.
By now, the Americans were flying planes that were armed with bombs, but still rudimentary in other respects, like the carriage of homing pigeons to dispatch messages in flight. However, even without sightings or sinkings, the patrols did curtail submarine activity.
We didn't see any submarine, but we understand after months of operation from our commanding officer that the sinkings within our area were greatly reduced.
Naval aviation was now set to make its next great step, the deployment of planes from ships. The first successful takeoff from a ship had been made by a civilian pilot, Eugene Ely, used by the US Navy in trials conducted aboard the USS Birmingham. He flew his plane from a specially constructed ramp over the ship's bow. This had taken place as early as the 14th of November 1910, but though the Navy was fascinated by the event, it was unable to develop it operationally. During the war, however, there was such a great need for aircraft to attend and reconnoiter for the fleet that attention was focused on the problem. Much of the testing was devoted to the seaplane, which would be able to land beside its tender for recovery. For launching planes, experiments were conducted with catapults, and the US was to invest considerable energy and ingenuity in systems for seaplane development from battleships and cruisers, right up to the Second World War. However, the seaplanes were slow and heavy, and it was obviously preferable to be able to deploy faster wheeled land planes, particularly if their role was in part to fend off attacking aircraft. The British developed the world's first aircraft carrier from a light cruiser, HMS Furious, over a long process that saw her twice rebuilt. Launched in 1917 with only a forward flight deck, she was almost immediately returned to the builders to receive an aft deck. At this time, she was also given a pair of deck lifts and a system of transverse arresting wires for landing aircraft. Already built with a handy speed of over 30 knots, she incorporated a number of features that are still essential aspects of any fleet carrier. By the war's end, naval aviation had developed a long way in the sophistication, speed, reliability, endurance, and weaponry of the planes, and in the means of deployment. In contrast to Captain Sugden's unarmed submarine patrol early in the war, by the last stages of the conflict, the planes were definite threats to the U-boats.
My job at Dunkirk was flying fighter cover to protect the anti-submarine patrol planes. One morning on a patrol, I was in a formation of 3 Henrios at about 3,000 feet, with the patrol plane at about 500 feet. It was very hazy. Suddenly, I saw a submarine below us, and the first thing I noticed was that they were firing at the patrol plane, and the bursts were coming uncomfortably close. In fact, they forced him to turn and run. However, they hadn't seen the Henrios, and we were in a dive with our machine guns open, and I believe that we shot some of the gun crew off the deck. As we were closing on the submarine, it started to submerge. And at that point, the patrol plane turned around and came back and dropped 2 depth charges on the spot. We circled, and in about a minute, the submarine came up bow first at an extreme angle, and then sunk back again stern first. We received official credit for a submarine on this patrol.
The 4 years of Europe's war dragged to a conclusion. Both sides were exhausted, bled of their manpower, and scarred by the brutality of the conflict. The legacies of the war were to be instability, extremism, and ultimately another war. The carnage led many to pacifist idealism, and there were to be repeated attempts to install a peaceful regime in world affairs. For the armistice, there was universal heartfelt relief and joy that the killing had stopped, at least for the moment, hopefully forever. For the US Navy, the peace brought massive immediate budget cuts and left only a kernel of the great organization that had been constructed. But this was a critical time for the Navy. Many lessons had been learnt, and these had to be digested and their implications pursued. The Navy contained an enormous spread of opinion about planes and their importance, and it was to be a debate that was fought long and hard. It was difficult for many admirals to believe that a swarm of gnats could threaten their battleships, built to withstand the fire of other battleships. The Navy's strength was in its guns, and the battleships of the fleet were not symbolic of its power, they were its power. The battle line retained its strategic supremacy. Also unchanged, despite spirited argument and demonstration from the air arm, was the broadly held understanding of naval tactics and the subsidiary roles allocated to the other naval units. In 1919, the Navy was given permission to convert the fleet collier Jupiter into an experimental carrier and renamed her Langley, after Professor S.P. Langley, a pioneer aviation theorist.
This is the photograph of the Langley when she was finally, as she was when she's finally converted. The conversion was authorized in 1919, but she wasn't commissioned until 1922. The ship was stripped down to its main deck, and then this superstructure put in there, built in like a railroad bridge. We had many things we had to work out. Since he was an experimental carrier, the forerunner of the Saratoga and Lexington, many, many things. There's not only the resting gear, it was the catapult, it was the firefighting, the handling of gasoline, the operational features of the hangar deck and the flight deck, and including even the organization of the air department.
There is no doubt that even in those battleship-obsessed times, there were a number of far-sighted Navy men who could see the writing on the wall. By the time of the Langley's commissioning in 1922, there was plenty of evidence to influence them. British experience with the Furious had impressed the Navy sufficiently for it to have vigorously pushed for the construction of 4 large, fast carriers. However, in hindsight, these would have been very strange ships indeed. They were designed with heavy surface armament, twin superstructures, and several other idiosyncrasies that would have made them into white elephants. They were rejected, not for their design deficiencies, but because of budgetary restrictions. Congress allowed only the money for the Langley's conversion. The politicians had accidentally made the right decision, and the Langley was to repay them handsomely, as she was to be an outstandingly successful laboratory and incubator for American naval air power. The Langley tried and tested methods that stood the Navy in good stead. With the experience gained on her decks, by the time the Navy secured funds for its next carriers, most of the misconceptions had been abandoned. Despite being based on battlecruiser hulls and the rather ridiculous inclusion of 8-inch gun batteries, the Lexington and Saratoga were to be successful carriers. Naval thinking about aircraft still revolved around battleships. The planes could supplement the cruiser lines and destroyer sweeps to reconnoiter for the fleet and locate enemy units. They could then keep an eye on the targets and guide the battle fleet into range. And then it would be over to the big guns, and the last role for the plane would be as an artillery spotter, advising fall of shot and directing the gunnery onto the victim. In the years of peace, it would remain the task of the aviators to convince those around them that far from being the spotter for the battleship's artillery, the aeroplane itself would, in the future, be the artillery. The Langley was slow, small and limited, but she, and not the proud battle line, was the face of the future. In 1920, the battleship was still the power of the fleet. Studies of the trajectories of incoming shells had given her armoured decks, and the invention of the torpedo and submarine had given her a belt of armour around her waterline. If, as the enthusiasts of aviation asserted, the aeroplane was a real threat, then obviously the versatile battleship would adapt to nullify that threat. The carrier was really only a side issue. The main debate was between the proponents of plane and battleship. One area where the two sides agreed was that there was a need to assess the situation practically, rather than in endless hostile theorizing. And so, in 1921, while the Langley was still under reconstruction, a series of trials were conducted to sink warships from the air.
The Navy had long wanted to carry out bombing tests against naval vessels, but was hampered because of a lack of adequate targets. Fortunately, at the end of the First World War, when Germany surrendered its ships, they were apportioned among the Allied naval powers. When the ships arrived, it formed a naval task force composed of Navy aircraft and Marine planes, and I was put in charge. The Navy invited the Army to take part in the tests, feeling that we all had a lot to learn about bombing ships and that all of our pilots should get experience in that work. The plan called for bombing one ship of each type: submarine, destroyer, cruiser, and battleship. And to attack all the ships, first with small bombs and then work up gradually to bigger and bigger bombs. To inspect the ships after each attack, and to have the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps planes alternate in the attacks. The big event, of course, was the bombing of the battleship Ostfriesland.
The Ostfriesland, of 22,000 tons, was still a fairly modern ship. Built in 1911, before the days of air attack, she was, nonetheless, constructed to withstand heavy bombardment, and the Germans had a well-deserved reputation for the quality of their armour, so she was seen as a serious test of the aeroplane's power. Waves of aircraft bombed her over a day and a half. She was hit repeatedly and extensively damaged, but remained seaworthy. Though she was a stationary target, few of the bombs dropped actually hit her, and she suffered major damage only when she was struck by a 2,000-pound bomb, the biggest available. Even then, she took hours to sink. Had she been given reasonable damage control and fire parties, she would have stayed afloat.
The next morning, the newspapers carried big accounts of the whole thing and created the impression throughout the country that aviation had made navies obsolete.
Though the aviation enthusiasts claimed a clear victory, fairer assessments were not so clear-cut. If the battleship had to adapt, then equally, the aeroplane still had a long way to go. Tests continued throughout the interwar years, seeing a series of old US battleships meeting the same messy and undignified scuttling. Meanwhile, within the Navy, aviation had secured some effective and forceful advocates, including the Chief of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, Admiral William A. Moffett.
Admiral Moffett has generally been called the father of naval aviation, and I think very properly so, because he is probably responsible more than any other one man for our having a single Navy, a single weapon system, making use of aviation as an integral part of the Navy, if not its main striking power. That was Admiral Moffett's accomplishment. He was a very attractive, forceful, and energetic man with a tremendous power of persuasion. And being a very brainy man, he tied in persuasion with logic. So he was able to put his ideas across both to the public and to the Navy itself.
Admiral Moffett died in the crash of one of the Navy's airships, but he'd overseen the Navy's thinking on aviation well, and his work in establishing an effective structure for naval aviation, staffed by dedicated and like-minded officers, meant that not only did he leave a clear course for development, but the men to see it followed. Naval aviation encompassed three major areas of operation. There were numerous patrol aircraft. These were large, long-range flying boats or ship-based seaplanes, charged with control of the sea lanes, reconnaissance, and active submarine attack, normally operating independently. Though effective at their jobs, they were not to be expected to dogfight their way in hostile airspace, being agonizingly slow and hard to defend. Even slower were the Navy's giant rigid airships, the ultimate in airborne observation platforms and capable of huge lifting, theoretically a highly effective anti-sub patrol or convoy escort. With ship-based mooring mast, the airships could travel with and aid the fleet, but history was to overtake them before the next war. The Navy also had numerous other smaller non-rigids, which performed their jobs very well, but a lot of glamour was invested in the airships, as well as a large amount of the scarce funds for naval aviation. Until 1927, the sole representative of the Navy's third air arm, carriers, was the little Langley. Though she was small, she saw the Navy's future leaders pass, and their experience in making a workable aerodrome out of her pocket handkerchief flight deck was to be the long-serving basis of carrier practice. Those who flew with the Langley retained a certain distinction within the Navy for many years. However, despite the Langley's small deck, and even with the limited pilot training of the day, the difficulty of working from the ship was more apparent than real. The planes themselves were so slow, stable and controllable that operations were more reliant upon nerve and skill than on luck.
The qualification consisted of 3 successful landings and takeoffs. And once you'd made 3 of them, you were a carrier pilot. And of course, we built this thing up. Those of us who were carrier pilots, we affected to look down our nose at all other aviators because we were Langley pilots. And we built this all up to be quite a thing. And then later, when we got the other carriers, and it was our job to train and classify other carriers, then we had to break it all down again and convince everybody it was easy and safe and nothing to it. That Langley was really something.
Various configurations and ideas were tried out in the quest for the most effective way of landing planes safely onto the narrow deck. This experimentation, of course, also included study of the aircraft and their ability to withstand the stresses of the often direct and severe shipboard landings. Transverse arrestor wires and fore and aft wires to prevent the plane from slewing over the side were used on the Langley individually and in combination. As part of the process of operational evolution, the arrestor hook, symbolic of the carrier aircraft, was developed and refined.
One of my jobs was to design the hook, the trailing hook that engaged the wires that was attached to the airplane. We had a very vague idea of what the stresses actually were on the airplane, yet they were important to have. in order to design the hook and its attachments, and also to know the distribution of the weights in the hole. So I borrowed from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics an accelerometer. It was the only one in existence. It was their pride and joy. And I faithfully promised that I'd take good care of it. The film that made the record, the accelerometer, was only good for 30 seconds. So it had to be turned on just as the airplane was coming over the ramp and the pilot was concentrating on making a precision landing. So I got in this VE-7 and circled around and came in for my landing. Just as I came over the ramp, I put my head in the cockpit to turn the switch on. But I must have unconsciously pushed the stick forward, because when I put my head out of that cockpit, that deck was coming up here 100 miles an hour. I was too low and too fast. I pulled back, but it was too late. My hook engaged the cross wire, but my axle hooks didn't engage the fore and aft wires. I had the dubious distinction of being the first man to go overboard on any of our aircraft carriers. It was the most embarrassing incident that I remember in my whole career, because I designed the hook that broke. I was flying the airplane that broke the hook, and I crashed an airplane, and I lost the NACA's accelerometer.
Admiral Pennoyer may have been the first to go over the side, but naval aviators were to discover many ways of getting into trouble during carrier operations and reward naval film crews with some prize crash footage. Future Admiral Gerald Bergan was one of the pilots filmed in the act of crashing during a landing on the Langley.
My tail hook, as it sometimes would happen, instead of engaging the arresting wire, rode one of these fore and aft wires, which caused the plane to slew to the left. There were several people, including Commodore Reeves, standing in the gallery near the two smokestacks on the port side, and I was afraid that my propeller would chew them up. So against all regulations, I gave her full throttle, and I did a very beautiful wing over the port side and into the drink. I was picked up by the plane guard.
Flying the airplanes on or off the carrier deck seemed quite an experience to us in those days, partly because of the rather low-power Hispano-Suizer engine and wooden propeller with which the airplane was equipped, and partly because of the configuration of the airplane itself. I remember we had to put 2 or 3 cushions into the cockpit seat in order to sit high enough to see over the rather sizable radiator which the liquid-cooled engine installation required. Also, the engine was rather sensitive to temperature changes, and whenever you varied the throttle up or down, you had also to vary the radiator shutters, which were manually operated. You felt a little like an organ player as you came in for a landing perched up on those cushions. One hand on the control column and one hand playing a tune, first on the throttle and then on the radiator shutters and then on the hook release and then back to the throttle and other odds and ends, so that all this time while you are making an approach with your wheels only a few feet above the water. What the Navy needed for this situation was a whole new deal in airplane and engine design. something which would make full use of the opportunities which the aircraft carrier offered, and yet be capable of the short takeoffs and landings required, and rugged enough to stand the beating of day-by-day operations into the arresting gear and by catapult shots. A new type power plant was also a key element in this program.
The development of the air-cooled radial engine was to revolutionize naval aviation, cutting weight, troublesome maintenance, and storage problems. Their weight savings made the use of catapults redundant until the post-war appearance of jet-powered planes. However, in the 1920s, the major problems for the Navy were not concerned with carrier aviation. A combination of naval treaties and funding constraints was suffocating the service. The Washington Naval Conference Accords of 1922 were designed to head off the ominous and cripplingly expensive battleship building competition developing among the major naval powers, and strict limits on building were agreed to. However, because the previous frenzy of construction meant that there were half-completed ships on all the nation's slips, allowances were made for the conversion of some of the hulls to carriers. For the United States, the good news was that it was authorized to complete 2 battlecruisers of the Lexington class as aircraft carriers. These 2 ships were launched in 1925, being commissioned as the Lexington and Saratoga in 1927. Compared to the Langley, the 2 ships were huge. They could carry and service up to 80 aeroplanes. Though there were flaws in their design, like the 8-inch gun turrets, the Lexington and Saratoga were fast, effective carriers with huge capability in defense and attack, and America was to be very glad of their services in the dark months after Pearl Harbor. By this time, the Navy had fully accepted the role of aeroplanes in the fleet, a point underlined by the Secretary of the Navy's order that all cadet officers receive tuition in aviation matters as a part of their training. Further, many experienced officers were undertaking special courses to qualify as pilots and gain first-hand experience in the Navy's new realm. Accompanying this growth in awareness and experience of aircraft among the Navy's officers and the consequent informed discussion of strategy and tactics, there was continued experimentation with the ships, the planes, and the weaponry. High-level bombing had proven itself near useless against a ship underway, and thinking had naturally turned to the scourge of shipping, the torpedo. The only effective defense against these weapons was that of the most heavily armored battleships. All other ships were highly vulnerable to torpedo attack, and much effort went into perfecting the use of torpedoes, and perfecting torpedoes that could withstand being dropped from an aeroplane at speed. The aerial complement of the ships broke up into fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. In addition, a couple of seaplane patrol aircraft were carried, which could be lifted out onto the water by crane or catapulted from the deck. But in the longer term, they became irrelevant. The carrier crews had their attention focused on the flat top's potential to act as an attack weapon. What the air crews practiced and thought about was offensive action. To better use their bombs, they invented the dive bombing technique, which was to be their most successful attack method. The result of the effort and experimentation of the carrier crews and their airmen was a working system. Through experimentation and refinement, the process of development was to continue unabated. But after the Langley, the 2 big new carriers started life as very effective machines from the first time they flew their aircraft aboard. In part, this was an accident of their birth as battlecruisers. The Navy was to show a leaning towards smaller ships, and Lexington and Saratoga were to remain the largest carriers up until the post-war Midway class. They had been built to the virtually unchanged cruiser hulls, with a massive hangar, 450 feet long, 70 feet wide, installed on top. There was a further maintenance shop, and below was a hold for storing spare aircraft. This gave a massive firepower through the big ship's many planes. To spare the fleet from having to follow the carrier's antics as she prowled round the wind to fly her planes off, she and her defensive screen and support ships were made into a separate unit. However, rather than having the forlorn look of an urchin set aside from the center of activity, the arrangement immediately suggested an active intent, an attacking formation. The carrier task force had been born. Where the Navy had obtained only 3 aircraft carriers, none of which had been originally laid down as such, it had dozens of types of aircraft. Most of these were designed specifically for operating in the harsh shipboard environment. The majority of types tested and used were in circulation for only a short time. Small orders and high attrition through crashes and mechanical failure over the sea saw the types rotated into and out of service regularly. Some manufacturers chose to specialize in the construction of Navy planes, and their designers became expert in the special considerations of carriers. The small production runs hampered the rapid growth of these firms, but they were, with bankruptcies and collapse widespread in aviation, happy to still be in business, and happier still to continue refinement of their design ideas. Steadily, the Navy's aircraft improved, and the carrier men delighted in the responsiveness and agility of their biplanes as they went about the serious business of practicing combat and attack tactics.
In those days, it wasn't, as I say, we were, to some degree, kind of pampered pets, prima donnas. We were developing dive bombing techniques. We were developing formation and tactical technique. We had a pretty free hand. Was it established fleet aviation as a real combat arm of the fleet? And I never had so much fun in my life.